Alright, time for another draftphysics.com video presentation. Debate physics also, but can't engage in any debate. So there's this person called Joe Scott, who I did contact a couple of years ago and attempted to offer him thousands of dollars to engage in a conversation about foundational physics and the credibility of the evidence for things like the double slit and kinetic energy and that kind of stuff. And to no avail, no response. So this is just such bad science. This guy's just repeating crap he read on a Wikipedia page. He's pretending to be informing people of something that's supposed to be real, and it's all so it's all on its face. I mean, you can just look at it and say, well, what about, and what about, and what about, but nobody forces him to answer those what abouts, the problems with what he's saying, the fact that they simply the statements aren't true. So we just play this, and there's just so many falsehoods and references to less than authoritative information, and it just all slides by, and they just all believe this crap, and it's junk science, and it's not funny. He thinks he's a comedian, but yeah, it's just not funny.
For today's video, I want to do a little experiment. Follow the instructions in this video. What it's going to do is it's going to show you how to shine a laser through.
Yeah, it's for a moron. Two slit for a moron. But anyway, yeah, it's easy to do. You can do it with needles. You can do it with lots of things. You can make a fringe pattern. But understanding what those patterns are and actually looking at them and seeing the difference in them is a little different. You have to play with it a little bit to, get a clearer picture. So maybe let's do that just to start, so I won't have to reference it in the middle of something else. But there's two patterns. There's a double slit pattern, okay, and there's a single slit pattern. Now, the single slit is the same as the two surface of the needle, the single impediment pattern, because it's really about a two surface pattern versus a four surface pattern. This can only be made by four surfaces. Okay, this is made by two surfaces. And so this would be the single slit, two surfaces, or the single impediment, two sides. So these are the experiments that Newton did, the inside and the outside surfaces. So Newton was already aware of these patterns. Well, he's aware of this pattern. And you get this double slit one by just multiplying the number of surfaces. So this is a four surface experiment. Two inside surfaces out here, two outside surfaces created by the middle finger. That creates this pattern. And they're both distinctive. They have features that are very distinctive. Okay? This one has the idea of little bars of light, little blobs of light, and a bigger pattern that the little blobs are being controlled by, an envelope pattern it's called. And this pattern has this distinctive double in the middle. And it is literally pretty close to a double. And this one's just duplicating that. So you can almost see that this single slit pattern is built into the double slit pattern. And there's really just two patterns. There's this pattern and then this little pattern. Yeah, so I could go on and just say, look, the outside surfaces create a very long, far distance apart. So that's what's creating the little bars, and the big bars are being created by the two closest surfaces, because that creates fewer wavelengths of difference, fewer places that there's a wavelength of difference. The wide distance creates lots of places there's a wavelength of difference. And when all four are in phase, you get a dot. When only two are in phase, you don't get a dot. When both are out of phase, you get a darker dot, a darker empty space. Okay. So, just as background. The argument is yes, the slit experiments can be understood as geometric vectors that cause them. That has nothing to do with waves. It can be understood, but they don't choose to understand. Yeah, so that's the real accusation. They've chosen to ignore the fact that they really haven't thought about it or researched it or played with it to realize that there's obvious features that give it away, that make it non-mysterious. Alright, back to the video.
Two tiny little slits and then project what that does against the wall.
So when you use tiny little slits, the catch is if the slits, the surfaces, are acting as the source of the fringe light. That is, they're doing the light deflecting. The surfaces are causing disturbance to some of the photons. And it's only some of the photons that become fringe photons. The total light in the fringe photons is only a small percentage of the light that goes straight through. So that should also be understood. If you make the 2 point sources very close together, you could understand that from very close together, there can't be a wavelength of difference because they're so close together. The bottom of the triangle doesn't have enough distance to create angles where you create a wavelength of difference in the sides. So two very close points can't create anything called interference or a wavelength of difference in the length of the lines. They have to be a certain minimum apart to start to create bars. And the further apart they are, the more little bars they'll create. These are just facts.
I want you to try this because you should see with your own eyes the phenomena that has led to a series of...
So he's talking to neophytes, I guess, if he's got to tell the whole audience to do this, and is assuming none of them know what a two-slit experiment is. So, and he's brainwashing, basically. He's whitewashing a subject to just spew a bunch of propaganda. So it's not much different than some preacher preaching some sort of Jesus story.
Discoveries that has challenged everything we know about life.
So they haven't challenged it all. They didn't think about it. They didn't consider it. They didn't really research it. They didn't really look at it. Because if they really looked at it, they'd see there's places where it gives it away that it doesn't work and it doesn't match. Their theory doesn't fit. So they have to acquit.
Light, matter, and reality itself.
So height, clickbait, whatever you want to call it.
Super answer file MLP Luigi said, can you do a video on the double slit experiment?
And so yes I can, and it's just garbage though. Can you do something intelligent on the subject? No, he can't.
Yes, I can.
Junk, crap, Wikipedia nonsense. You don't know anything about the subject. You did a half-day's research, and it's just spewing a bunch of gurgitated crap. Bird barf.
Oh, right, here we go. Let's step in the Wayback Machine to the late 1600s.
So the late 1600s, just meaning Newton. Newton did all this work. There was nobody who really competed with Newton in terms of experiments regarding light. And Newton owned the subject.
It was pretty much settled science that light travel is a particle. There have been a lot of experiments to back this up, and it even had the support of Sir Isaac Newton, and he was not known to be wrong.
So it's not just about him not being known to be wrong, as they did all these diligent and tons and tons of experiments, figured out all kinds of stuff that you just say, wow, how the fuck did he do that? Figured out rainbows, figured out all kinds of stuff about light.
About things. But then a physicist named Thomas Young created the double slit experiment.
So, and again, Newton had already done the experiment, frankly. Okay, there was nothing special. Newton had done this, the single slit. Newton had done this, the single impediment, two surfaces. He had seen this pattern. It wasn't a new thing. Fringe pattern wasn't new science.
experiment. And it consisted of a box through which light traveled through two very tiny slits.
So he's stolen footage from Veritasium, who concedes in the video he's doing he couldn't find any exact drawings of Young's experiment, didn't know exactly how he did it, so he just invented his own version of it. It's in the video, okay? So this isn't anything, this isn't real.
And then a little eye hole where he could look in and see what that did when it projected to the other side of the box. The thinking was that if it traveled like a particle, it would create two parallel...
So this is he's projecting this thinking, okay? This isn't something I've seen Young actually say, so this is all crap they just made up. Young wasn't really making a comparison between particles and waves. He was just supporting the fact that it looks like a wave. Waves would explain it. He wasn't making some stupid, frankly, argument that isn't true. So this they do over and over. So this stupid clip he got, you see, it's just, this is none of this is original content. He's stolen clips from the Dr. Quantum video, which is this, religiously motivated piece of crap. It's junk science, okay, about how our consciousness is controlling the photons. I mean, it's crap science, and he's using it in the video. I mean, it's just, why don't you put in some flat earth footage? It's just really, really bad. Now, they all do this, what he's going to do right here. Every single one of these dopey scientists, right? These are scientists, and they do this silly thing.
Lines on the other side of the box because it was projecting through those.
Okay, so you see what he drew, right? I have the two lines, and they project two lumps. Well, in reality, these two lines are less than a millimeter apart. A lot less in the case of these double slit experiments. So you're talking about a half millimeter, a quarter millimeter. The whole experiment's a quarter millimeter across. It doesn't create anything on the surface that's bigger than that. All the light doesn't spread. The light coming from distant stars, it's obviously not spreading, right? I mean, it doesn't come to you and it keeps spreading and turns into a big halo. No, you can see the star, okay? You can see there's direct light. There's light that goes straight from one thing to the other thing. The two lumps would be so close to each other on the target that there would be fractions of a millimeter difference from where they land on the board. Fraction of a millimeter. So you're talking about a pattern that, a scatter pattern that could be, 6 inches across, and you're going to tell the difference because one is 6 inches plus a half a millimeter from the other one. The 6-inch thing is just a half millimeter difference. Just a tiny little edge of what I'm sticking out over this side. They'd be right on top of each other. You couldn't tell. And they keep pretending this. This is pretending. This isn't what you would expect if you were a scientist. If you were a scientist and knew anything about light, you'd know it generally travels in a straight line.
Lines, just like bowling balls flying through pins at the end of the bowling lane.
Right, bowling alleys are nice and straight, so if you had a bowling alley that was less than a millimeter wide, you wouldn't expect it could knock down pins that is 4 feet across.
That's not what happened. What he saw instead was the same string.
Was this, right, so this, he didn't use monochromatic light, and what he saw was a pattern, all right, that, you can't tell by looking at this, because all the colors are shifted on top of each other. So you can't really see how big the bars actually are. So, not doing it with monochromatic light really does degrade what you're going to see.
Each pattern of lines that you're seeing in this experiment. Young recognized what he was seeing right away.
So again, this is where they just pretend that the simplest pattern in the universe, fundamentally on and off, is somehow always has to be some sort of interference thing. It has to be some sort of water interference, water wave interference.
It's an interference pattern.
And there's no, so in this case, there really isn't such a thing, okay? Because what I probably should do is I'll draw the difference again, just so you'll notice it when you see it, and you'll just say, ah, yeah, that's kind of obvious. Why don't they say that? I mean, why don't they tell you the truth? Okay, that the wave pattern created by mediums like water, okay, the pattern that's created by water doesn't look like this. It looks like this. All the same size. Okay. Now, I didn't really draw this one the right size, but anyway, they're all the same size. Okay, that's what water waves create. There's no double maxima. See, this is supposed to, and there's no, this is a double slit pattern. It's supposed to look like this. This is the double slit in photons. This is the double slit in water. Because water only creates two waves, right? I mean, water through two slits. Let's just understand what you're seeing. Okay, through two slits, there's just two sources. There's this source, and there's this source. So I could put a circle here. That's the source, essentially radiating in these directions, and that can create this pattern. No double maxima. Just keep pointing that out. Doesn't happen. All right, and you can sort of understand that what's really happening. This is supposed to be this. This is the single slit pattern. This is almost the single slit in water, but it's missing the double maxima. But you could also figure out that, well, how, if I had a single slit, how could I have two waves? Where would the two waves be? How does a single slit? It creates one wave. How does it create two waves? And their math says the waves, if I'm going to make two waves, the two waves would have to be here and here. This is the distance from the centers. That's what they use in the math. This distance. They don't use this distance and this distance. They use this distances. Because these are point sources. And that's what creates the pattern. So when they say double slit in water, it's really the single slit. Because it's only two sources. Two sources. That's all there are. Just two. 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 And that's why you get this dull pattern with water. It's because there really is only two sources in the double slit. Obviously if you do a real double slit, there's four sources. Each surface is a source. Four source experiment. So there's the two source experiment, two surface, and the four surface. And those are the real distinctions. So when they say they're comparing frankly, the double slit in water is only creating a single slit type pattern, and it's missing a key feature. This double maxima is missing in water. So he's going to do all this stating that there's no other conclusion, but it's the same thing. It's not the same thing. It's foolish, because the pattern's an on-off pattern. To say any on-off pattern, simplest pattern in the universe, is somehow interference.
You see, when waves combine, it creates what's called interference.
Whoops.
Like if you take waves in water, when they hit each other.
So you can see he's bobbing two objects. It's two sources. That's the single slit. And he's getting single slit pattern without the double maxima. So again, it's similar to the single slit in light, but it's missing a key feature.
The peaks will combine to create taller peaks, and the peaks...
As you can see, there's no double maxima. So there's no double here in the center. So where the two meet, they don't create a double. All right? So it's not the same pattern. Now, there's also another catch to this that's a little more complicated, so I'll just say it because it's not that hard to imagine. The fact is, even Young's drawing has the fact that these, in waves, in water waves, they end up being in a parabola. The lines aren't straight. But as I've noted in just the last video or two, you can see, using a laser, that the fringe pattern is actually being created by very straight lines. and they're not parabolas. So it's kind of a giveaway, okay, that it's not imitating water waves. It's not the same function.
And troughs will cancel each other out, which creates this pattern of higher peaks and then stillness. And when that gets projected against the surface...
So again, this isn't what you'll see in light. You certainly won't see it in... You won't see it in the double slit, and you won't see it in the single slit. It doesn't happen this way. There's always this double maxima in the center. And they've just left that out.
You get the weird double slit experiment pattern.
So that's not the pattern. That little sloppy simulation isn't what you really see.
Only happens if light is traveling as a wave.
So again, he says it again. And no, you haven't traveled the whole universe. I'm sure there's on-off patterns that happen for lots of reasons that don't have anything to do with any kind of wave. The simplest pattern in the universe. Spinning, orbiting planets, create a gravitational signal to the rest of the universe. No reason to think it's a wave.
That's the only explanation for this.
All right, so that's what they all say. It's the only explanation. It's nail in the coffin. Can't draw any other conclusion. It's got to be a wave. Waves win. And no, they don't. It doesn't match. I mean, in water, the thing's going up and down. It's going on and off. The light isn't turning on and off. I mean, there's so many things that are missing from that explanation, that comparison. And they just keep using it and keep saying, basically, we didn't give it any thought. We like waves, so we're going to believe in waves, even though the evidence really isn't very good.
The test was replicated in hundreds of different ways in the years following this discovery, and even Isaac Newton himself had...
So he's lying here. Okay, Newton didn't say any such thing. I think he thought he was, his script probably said he was supposed to say Einstein. And yes, Einstein made some concessions, but wave-particle really wasn't an argument in Newton's time in the sense of they really didn't talk about any duality. It was either a wave or it was a particle. Nobody was buying the wavicle crap.
To concede that yes, light can travel as a wave, but other experiments showed it traveling as a particle. So what is it, light?
So he didn't even show that or say anything about that. So we know that a bunch of other experiments they're talking about in the Einstein error, the photoelectric effect for which he got the Nobel Prize, was pretty strong evidence that none of this stuff is anything other than corpuscular. It travels in clumps. Even Richard Feynman, who decided to just run away from the subject and say, let's just calculate, let's not bother thinking about it, concedes. Light isn't a wave. The devices we use to manipulate and use photons don't work that way.
Well, this particle-wave duality became known over time as, the particle-wave duality. And it was a mystery that confounded science.
So again, it confounded nothing. It was just the fact that they want to believe in woo-wee crap. And so this was just another example of make the universe interesting. The universe would be too boring and dull if there was simple explanations for what happened. People don't want to hear that they don't have free will and that they're programmed robots and all of that crap. They want to hear that there's some sort of spiritual mumbo-jumbo that's going to somehow make them all special.
For the next 200 years.
So it's really anti-science in a big way. It's really just a religion 3.5 or whatever. Just more of the same old make-up bullshit and tell people what they want to hear.
By the 1920s, the physics community had much better instruments.
Okay, let me do this. Sorry about that part.
At their disposal, and they decided to add another layer to the double slit experiment. You'll see this over and over again, experiments building on top of other experiments.
I mean, I didn't have the Veritasium thing showing, that was bad of me, so let me just show that part. So you can see he's bouncing two balls, That means there's only two sources. That means it's basically a single slit pattern. It's not a double slit pattern. There's only two sources. The double slit has four sources. That's why there's two patterns built into it. Is because there's 2 and 2. And when the 2 and 2 come together, they create two close surfaces and two far away surfaces. And that's the cause of the pattern. All right, sorry about the not keeping track of what's on.
Taking as waves and colliding with each other on the other side of the slit, what would happen if you fired the photons through one at a time? The mystery that confounded science for the next 200 years. By the 1920s, the physics community had much better instruments at their disposal, and they decided to add another layer to the double slit experiment. You'll see this over and over again, experiments building on top of other experiments, increasing in complexity and weirdness.
So this isn't entirely true, okay? So the fact is they tried to do the single photon experiment back in the 1800s. So might even be a little before that. So it might have been done even before Young, before 1801. But regardless, it was done. And so they attempted to do single photon experiments to verify that the effect, I don't think so much they were thinking about things interfering with themselves. That wasn't really the idea. The idea was just to see a little deeper and see if photons are doing this as individual objects or whether they are in fact colliding with each other or something else. And the fact is they reduced the light that went into the two slits. They could in fact still create the pattern, but there's an explanation.
The twist in the experiment was basically asking the question that if the photons were behaving as waves and colliding with each other on the other side of the slit, what would happen if you fired the photons through one at a time? The guess is that you would get the particle pattern of two complementary parallel lines. After all, how can you get a wave interference pattern when there's nothing to interfere with?
So there'd be no parallel lines because obviously the two sources are too close together to create parallel lines. So that's just more of the bullshit. And so what's coming up is some explanation of, again, resorting to a Veritasium video that I have previously debunked because it's garbage science.
So they gave it a try.
So this is Veritasium's chart. And as you can see, the chart doesn't make any sense because there's neither a double maxima and there's no indication that this is just the center of some bigger fringe pattern. So the experiment had so much noise in it, half the signal was noise. So it's a really weak result, really weak. And the fact is Veritasium had to cheat to get that bad result. So to get that really terrible data, frankly, it doesn't fit anything, he had to cheat. The experiment, so I'll draw some of that. So they never have single photon sources. There's no gun that makes single photons. So what Veritasium was doing was he had a light bulb. He bought the kit. It's like he didn't even do this experiment, frankly. He just has he's given enough money by the YouTubeverse that he can throw it away on all kinds of garbage. So he bought a kit that you do the experiment with. So the kit's designed to produce, the result. Anyway, so what they do is they have a regular light bulb and they just put filters in front of the light bulb to try to reduce the number of photons that would be in the experiment. And the idea is to reduce this number so low that it'd be like 2 or 3 a day or something. So you could do the experiment over a 40 or 50 day period. Now there is some documentation, and you can't find any images of it, that some French guy did it and let the experiment run for 3 or 4 months. He went sailing and just let it sit in a box in the dark. But who knows? Some English guy did, I think it was like 40 days. And the fact is they still got a fringe pattern, okay, after the 40-day period. But the argument can be made is that you're not really sure you're getting single photons, in the sense that you're sending these photons through all of this material. And how does this material work? It's really a bunch of surfaces. So you're creating zillions of what I would argue are broken photons. So you're not really stopping pieces of photons from getting through the experiment. And so you have a whole bunch of dot, 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 dot. And you need dot, 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 okay, to make a photon. And all you have are twos. You have a bunch of twos coming out, and you need a 3. And all that's happening is just when it goes through the slits, that's where you fix that problem by changing the path length of 2 different ones. And by doing that, you put them back in phase. Or 50% of the time, you put them out of phase. Okay, so the third one is either too close or too far. But that's all you're really doing. You're just breaking the photons, throwing the pieces at the experiment, so there's pieces at both surfaces all the time. That's why you can make a photon. So Veritasium did the experiment the right way, taking maybe 10 hours to do the experiment. That is, he dulled the light so much that very few pieces could be getting through. And the experiment would take 10 hours to get enough photons to get results. But it didn't work. He couldn't get any pattern. So he had to cut it. And he cut all the way down to 5 minutes. Okay, so we know that lots of pieces were going through. So he essentially took out one of the filters, okay, to ensure there was more pieces in the experiment, and then claimed success. And obviously all he did was guarantee that there was lots of energy heading for those slits, and therefore lots of potential to be making photons out of those pieces. Perfectly viable explanation. Physics doesn't care. But clearly they don't have any proof that they have one photon flying through the air at any one moment. There's no proof that they have a single photon source.
To everyone's shock and amazement.
So more nonsense. Why would they be shocked and amazed?
They still got the interference pattern. But how? How? There is nothing for that photon to be bumping into. What could it possibly be colliding with?
So nothing is colliding. So again, that's more of just their fable. All that's really happening is you're breaking photons. A polarizing filter doesn't absorb energy. It doesn't kill photons. It breaks the phase. And the polarizing film kind of gives it all away, because if you know how the thing really works, the polarizing film is just changing through layers. By piling up 2 layers, it's changing the phase of the light that goes through. So the light that goes through 2 layers is a wavelength, a half wavelength out of phase. So it's putting the photon pieces out of phase with each other. And then you can put another filter in diagonally and fix that phase that you broke. So again, other experiments prove what they're saying isn't the truth. The radio experiment proves it has nothing to do with colliding photons, because you can have a source here and a source here, and then you can put your signal, your receiving source, right in between, and you can just move it and you'll detect the same exact pattern. The same on-off pattern will take place right in this space, and these 2 signals will never touch each other. They'll never interfere. They'll never have contact until they hit the surface, demonstrating it's not waves.
To create this pattern? The answer? Itself. You see, somehow this photon was going through both slits at the same time and then colliding into itself.
So again, the photon was, the thing with a size that's, this big somehow was going through two openings that are this far apart. Yeah, I don't think so.
On the other side of the barrier. And this revealed a fundamental truth about quantum mechanics. In a waveform state, quantum objects exist in a probability state, meaning
So they just make this still fable up. This is just telling me about gremlins and how whether the gremlins part their hair on the left side or whether they part their hair on the right side. They just made up all this crap, these silly stories.
that at any given time it could go through the left slit or the right slit or hit the barrier. While in a waveform state, that photon is all three at once. It is 33% in the left slit.
So this is more of this nonsense that basically somehow a photon leaves, it goes everywhere, right? And so if I allow it to travel a long distance, like let's say I allow a photon to travel from here to Neptune, some of the photon will be going to Jupiter, and some will go to our moon, and some will go all kinds of places. And somehow, magically, it decides that it's only going to go to one of those places. And even though the moon's a lot closer, it doesn't go to the moon every time. So even though it goes to the moon and kind of just sits there and waits, because it's waiting to see where it's going to get de-entangled. Because it doesn't get de-entangled at the first thing it gets hit. It gets de-entangled at, its random choice of all the planets in the universe. I mean, all the planets in the solar system. And then all the other energy is retracted. They send it all back and it all goes to one place. I mean, the story is ridiculous. It's just it's just pathetic that nobody challenges this nonsense.
33% in the right slit and 33% hitting the barrier.
So it just doesn't happen. We know a ton of light hits the barrier. A lot more than 33% of the light hits the barrier. So again, right on its face, nonsense. The tiny percentage of the light that goes to the target is fringe light. When you have a fringe pattern, it's a tiny percentage of the total light you put into the experiment. Tiny percentage. Indicating that it's just about how close the photon went to a surface. The closer it went to a surface, the more likely it got bent. The further away, the less likely. And Newton proved this by taking an aperture and making it smaller and smaller and smaller. And by doing so, he guaranteed that a higher and higher percentage of the light created rings. Right? Because a round thing creates rings, not a linear pattern. It creates a pattern in all directions. So it has bars in all directions. Rings. Okay. So again, they can't get any of this right.
So that's incredibly simple math. There are highly complex equations out there.
So highly complex equation, you ought to just say made up bullshit equations, because this little forky thing, that's the symbol for all knowledge in the universe. So you multiply something times something, and then you multiply it times all the knowledge in the universe, and then divide it by 4. And somehow you get some sort of answer. It's crap. I think these are kets and bars or something. It's bullshit math. And so he just claims it answers a question somewhere. That somewhere somebody asked a question and they use this crap formula to give you an answer. I haven't seen that anywhere. I haven't seen a single person take this crap and somebody looks at it like a wheel and says, what's the angular displacement of the wheel, or some kind of question, and they use that crappy formula to answer. There's not a single video where that takes place. No, what they do is spin the wheel and find out what the answer is, because that formula is not going to help you at all.
Calculate probability states with a high degree of accuracy.
So he says, where's the high degree of accuracy? You haven't even gotten the double maxima right. How the hell do you have a high degree of accuracy? You haven't even explained why it's there. Why is there a double maxima in the center? Will you explain why it's there? No.
But eventually the waveform has to go back down to a particle, and that's called the wave.
So again, it's more nonsense. Again, they can't even, the simple question you could ask, how can 2 waves pop out of one slit? How does that happen? Huh? One slit. How do I get 2 waves coming out of one slit? How does the photon go through the single slit twice? How does it go through the single slit and then go through the single slit a second time? How does it do that to interfere with itself to make a pattern? How does the single photon going into the single slit experiment create interference patterns? How did the single photon interfere with itself? Because the single slit still creates the pattern with single quote unquote photons. So how did this single photon go through the slit and there's no second slit to go through? How did it do that? How did it interfere with itself?
Collapsing. In the case of the double slit experiment, that happens when it hits the back wall. And this experiment is
so again, it happens, okay, when you have sources from different places and the sources provide something to the location. So more than one source has to be providing information, or there can't be any kind of interference or any kind of constructive or destructive. There has to be more than one source. You have to be able to draw the vector lines. That's why they say the particle has to go through both slits. But in the single slit, how did it do that? Single slit can have 70 bars, 70 fringe pattern bars that you could see. Okay, how does the single photon interfere with itself to create all of those different locations?
Okay, over and over and over again, even with different particles like photons, electrons.
So this is another one of the lies. They're completely different experiments, not even close to the same experiment. They just pretend, we're just going to say it's the same experiment because it's fun to lie. But that's all these are. These are lies. You're doing an experiment inside of an electron microscope. It's not the same experiment, frankly. I think even an idiot could figure that out. You're shooting the light through a crystal. It's not the same experiment. Even an idiot could figure that out.
Protons, even whole atoms and molecules.
So more nonsense. The pattern, as bad as that Veritasium outcome was, in terms of noisy and the pattern isn't even coherent to any expectation, the ones with atoms are even worse. Because guess what? Atoms, you can't really discharge atoms either. They're charged. You can't really push them past something without them being disturbed by the electrons and protons on the surface they're going to go by.
So now we know that fundamental elements...
I mean static charges. You can't really... Atoms are really hard to manipulate without static charges screwing up your experiment.
Elements of matter can pop in and out of existence through probability.
So he just said it. Somehow all this leads to the conclusion that atoms can pop in and out of existence based on some probability. Where's the popping in and out of existence? Where does this interference thing say something popped out of existence? I mean, in water waves, none of the water molecules are popping out of existence. Why in water waves we don't have to believe the interference is created by popping in and out of existence, but somehow with photons we do? I mean, none of this has any explanation. It's just such mush. So this is the religious explanation. This isn't science.
But that's where things just start getting weird. Because for the next evolution of the double slit experiment, they wanted to see if they could measure the probability states as they went through the slits. So they set up a little detector on one of the slits to see if they could measure it. This was called the which way experiment.
Yeah, it doesn't happen. So there's no detector, okay, for photons at all. There's just no way to detect a photon. And you can't even do it with electrons. So again, I won't even bother playing this, because this is all nonsense. These experiments have no credibility. These people don't even know what a beam splitter is, and they're going to put it through 2 different beam splitters, and then they're going to bounce it off 9 or 10 mirrors and tell us what's happening. Yeah, I mean, it's such convoluted crap. No point. So just nonsense experiments. For the purpose of propagandizing for wooey physics. So it's not good science, and that's just a fact. This is all really bad science, all hype, whitewash bullshit. Okay, it doesn't include all of the true facts. The fact is that Newton discovered the fringe patterns, not Young. And Young presented them. Too bad he didn't show the Young drawings, but the Young drawings were just terrible in the sense that they clearly weren't showing double slit patterns. He didn't show a pattern that had the right features to be called a double slit pattern. He was clearly seeing single slit patterns because he had 2 of the slits so close together they're the same point source. So maybe I just draw that one more time just to make sure you to emphasize the point that this is about point sources. It's about creating places where the photon is disturbed and now creates a new source of light, essentially. So it's just that it's so simple, you know, that even even a Joe could figure it out, maybe. Oh fuck. Well, anyway, so if I put the slits in, I'm saying the surfaces are what's causing the phenomenon, and the real reason you get this pattern is because electrons are going in and out of the surface. So that's why it spreads in one dimension. So that's why the slit surface this way creates a pattern that goes this way. Okay, it's because the electrons are going in and out. So some of the photons, some of the pieces go this way, some of the pieces go that way on each one of these surfaces. So each surface is creating photons that can be bent in either one of these directions. Okay. And then all those pieces just fly onto a wall, and there's a 50-50 chance, okay, that when they hit, they're going in phase, or when they hit, they're going out of phase. Where they're going out of phase, it'll be dark. Where they're going in phase, they'll be light. And math works out perfect, okay, for straight line vectors where you're just figuring where pieces go in the straight lines, okay, where they're all four sources are in phase, there's a dot. Now if I put these surfaces really close together, if I make very small slits, you could sort of, if you have some kind of brains, if this is less than a few wavelengths of light, you can understand that the distance between these 2 points. So here's the point source, here's a point source, here's the point source, here's a point. These 2 point sources can't create any vectors where there's a wavelength of difference in the line. These lines can't ever be a wavelength of difference because there's not enough difference here. So you have to have wavelengths of difference in the distance between a surface to create the pattern. So all it's really doing is just making a single slit. It's making 2 sources. So instead of 4 surfaces, you don't really have 2 because 2 of them are so close together they look like the same source. That's why they don't get the double slit pattern. That's why Young didn't draw the correct pattern. It's because that's not what he was getting. Okay, he didn't get the correct pattern. Because he wasn't really doing a correct double slit experiment. Just to do the right experiment, and I'm sure he saw it, but he just didn't write about it, you have to have the slits open, wide. And now you have 4 sources. And those 4 sources, where all 4 sources are in phase, you get a light. Where only 2 sources are in phase, you get a dark. Well, I have to use this as the example over here. Okay, so where all 4 are in phase, you get one of these bright dots. Where only 2 sources, the 2 outside ones, are in phase, you just get a dot. A dark spot. Because 2 of them are in phase and 2 of them aren't. So you're going to have 2 sources, so this is darker. And that's the key factor, is the space between the dots. It just means it's darker. It's not completely dark. Here is where it's completely dark, because now here neither source is in phase. But that's what's creating the pattern. The furthest distance is making the little dots. The closest distance between 2 surfaces is deciding the envelope. So completely understandable as straight line vectored energy quanta, as Einstein would say. So, yeah, enough of a video and such. So, just another example of the garbage science that's on the internet. Nobody challenges it. They just keep selling this silly story to impressionable morons and little kids. They get them thinking in all kinds of wrong directions because they hype this garbage that somehow if you analyze this experiment you can't come up with any kind of a rational explanation. Instead you have to come up with an irrational one. That photons have ESP and they have twin brothers and all kinds of You can retract energy. Energy can go somewhere in the universe and you can just retract it. You know, it just make it disappear. All nonsense. And all based on a silly interpretation of a simple experiment that is telling you, don't fall for those silly seems like. Yeah, it looks a little bit like waterways, but if you look at it at all, you'll see a key feature. That double maxima in the middle is a key giveaway. This ain't interference. And we don't pay any attention. Just ignore the facts, sell the hype. Not funny, Joe.